Hello everyone and welcome to this IELTS grammar lesson. I want you to listen to a man giving a talk on the radio about protecting your home from burglaries. Here are some of his sentences. I want you to read and try to complete them.
Today's guest is Bill Murphy, who worked for the police force for over 17 years until his retirement last week. Welcome to the show, Bill. You're going to tell us how to protect our homes, is that right?
Thank you. Yes, that's right. As you say, I used to work for the police force and I must have seen hundreds of burglaries during that time. Unfortunately, burglaries seems to be on the increase. The number of burglaries in our area rose by 25% last year. What's so frustrating is that it's possible to prevent many burglaries. For example, a few weeks ago, a woman called to report a robbery at her house. It happened at 5 in the afternoon while she was watching the news on TV in a room at the back of the house. Her son was also at home. He was doing his homework in his bedroom when the burglar came into the house.
So how did the burglar break in without anybody hearing him?
Well, this woman used to keep the front door locked at all times. But when her son got older, he often went out to visit his friends after school, so she would leave the door unlocked whenever she was at home so he could come and go easily. The burglar simply walked in through the front door, which was unlocked, and no one heard a thing. So you see, you do need to be careful to lock your door at all times of the day.
Absolutely. And what did the burglar steal?
On this occasion, the burglar came in through the front door, picked up the woman's handbag, and while she was watching the TV, he emptied it out and stole her purse. The son didn't hear anything because he was listening to music and working on his computer upstairs. Then the burglar went into the front room, opened all the cupboards, and took a valuable collection of CDs. But the surprising thing is that after that, he went into the kitchen and stole the roast chicken the woman had cooked for dinner. So, you see, it really is important to make sure that...
Let's complete the sentences together. A few weeks ago, a woman called to report a burglary. It happened at 5 in the afternoon when she was watching the news on TV. This woman used to keep the front door locked. When her son got older, she would leave the door unlocked whenever she was at home. The burglar simply walked in through the front door. The son didn't hear anything because he was listening to music. Then the burglar went into the front room, opened all the cupboards, and took a valuable collection of CDs. Now, pause the video. Look at these sentences one more time and try to answer these questions. Which two sentences provide a background scene and an action? Which two sentences talk about a single completed action in the past? Which sentence describes a series of completed actions in the past? Which two sentences talk about a repeated action in the past? Did you realize which 4 structures were used in these sentences? As you may have noticed, the sentences contained simple past, past continuous, would, and used to. In this video, we're going to talk about all these structures to talk about past stories. Let's look at the first example. A few weeks ago, a woman called to report a robbery at her house. We use the past simple to talk about completed actions in the past. We often mention the time, like a few weeks ago, like in our example, or other time references like last week and yesterday. But if the person we're talking to already knows the time, it is not necessary to add the time reference. For example, let's imagine I'm telling you a story about last week when someone broke into my house, and in the middle of my story, you ask me a question like, how did the burglar break in without anybody hearing him? Here, you can simply ask your question without mentioning last week, because you already know when it happened. We can also use the simple past to give a series of actions in the order that they happened. For example, the burglar came in through the front door, picked up the woman's handbag, emptied it out, and stole her purse. In these sentences, we often use next or then to show the sequence of actions. The simple past is also used to talk about repeated actions in the past. When her son got older, he often went out to visit his friends after school. Remember, to talk about past repeated actions, we might also use used to or would. I will explain this in detail when we talk about used to and would. And the last usage of simple past is to talk about long-term situations in the past that are not true anymore. For example, Bill Murphy worked for the police force for over 17 years, which means he doesn't work for them anymore. Remember that for this usage, we can also use used to. I will again explain this in detail when we talk about used to and would. Now, read this table to check how you can make simple past affirmative, negative, and the question form. Our second past tense in this video is past continuous. We use the past continuous to describe the scene for a story, or we use it to give background information about something that happened in the past. For example, the picnic was so much fun. The sun was shining, the kids were running around, and the adults were playing volleyball. But remember, it is possible to have more than one background scene happening at the same time. For example, he was listening and working on his computer. We also use this tense to talk about an activity that was already happening when something else happened. With this use of past continuous, we often use words like when, while, and as. For example, it happened at 5 in the afternoon while she was watching the news on TV. Or you can say, he was doing his homework in his bedroom when the burglar came into the house. Sometimes we have an activity interrupting the other. The activity that was already happening is in the past continuous, like she was doing her homework. And the activity that interrupted it is in the past simple, like the burglar came into the house. We also use the past continuous when we want to emphasize the activity without focusing on its completion. For example, for a while last year, I was working at cinema, studying for my degree, and writing a column for the local newspaper. In this example, we don't know if the actions were completed or not, or whether they happened at the same time, so we use the past continuous. But in this sentence, when we say last year I worked at the cinema, studied for my degree, and wrote a column for the local newspaper, it suggests all of the jobs are now complete and probably happened in that order. Remember, state verbs describing thoughts, feelings, senses, and possession like know, love, feel, and belong that we discussed in our first grammar lesson do not generally have a continuous form. Look at this table to check how you can make past continuous. The affirmative, negative, and the question form. You can see that to make the past continuous, you use was or were plus an ing verb. The words used to and would in front of an infinitive verb, like used to eat and would leave the door open, tell us that someone did an activity regularly or several times in the past. In other words, they are used to talk about people's habits in the past which do not repeat anymore. For example, she used to keep the front door locked. This sentence means that she has stopped keeping the door locked. Or we might say she would leave the door unlocked. But keep in mind that would is unusual in the negative form and in the form of yes/no questions. Apart from past habits, used to can also describe a past state or situation which is no longer true. For example, she used to live in Japan, but now she lives in London. This sentence means that she lived in Japan before, but not anymore. Now she lives in London. If you replaced would with used to here, you would have this sentence. She would live in Japan, but now she lives in London. This sentence has a totally different meaning. This sentence suggests that she had a previous plan or desire to live in Japan. However, something changed and now she currently lives in London instead. This sentence implies that there was a shift or a change in her plans that caused her to relocate to London instead of Japan. I told you at the beginning of this video that for long-term situations in the past, we can use both past simple and used to. But do not use used to if you want to talk about how long the situation lasted. We can say he used to work for the police or he worked for the police. But do not say he used to work for the police for 17 years. Instead, say Bill Murphy worked for the police force for over 17 years. It is not common to use used to show a time period. One more point. With the state verbs, do not use would. You can only use used to. For the full lesson on state verbs, please watch our video titled IELTS Grammar Present Continuous versus Present Simple. Now, let's do an exercise together to learn where we should use would, used to, or simple past. A teacher and student are talking about local customs. Pause the video and fill in the gaps with the verbs in brackets in the correct form. Use would, used to, or past simple where possible. Let's go through the answers now. What sorts of things did you used to do as a child? As we have said before, would is not usually used in the form of a question to ask about regular things that have happened in the past. You could ask, what would you do as a child? But that would mean something different. So in this case, what would you do if you were a child has a hypothetical meaning. Oh, when I was a child growing up in Japan, there were many customs that we would follow or used to follow. Both of these sentences are okay. For example, I remember we moved house when I was 7 and we visited our new neighbors with gifts. In this sentence, moving and visiting did not happen regularly, so the simple past is used. At that time, the tradition was that people would give or used to give gifts of Japanese noodles, but it is different now and people tend to give things like soap or towels or nothing at all. Now, this sentence talks about a tradition followed by people in the past, which is different now. So both used to and would can be used. Did you used to have one tradition that you particularly remember? Now, this one is a question, and the verb have is a state verb that shows possession. For these two reasons, we're not allowed to use would. So the correct answer is, did you used to have one tradition that you particularly remember? Yes, one tradition that I used to really like was in the spring when the cherry blossoms were out. Like is another state verb because it shows a state of feeling. Would is not used with state verbs. So in this sentence, we must say, I really used to like, or I used to really like. As a family, we used to go or we would go into the countryside, and we used to spend and we would spend the day eating, drinking, and singing. Now, for these two gaps, both would and used to are possible. One year, my father took a lovely photo of me and my sisters, and I still keep that picture on my wall today. Now, in this sentence, taking a photo was not an action done repeatedly. It was only done one time. So we must use the simple past rather. All right, let's look at another one. Did you used to have to do anything you didn't like? Well, this is a question, so would is not used. We should say, did you used to have to do anything you didn't like? Yes, I remember how we used to have to clean the house thoroughly. Would is not used with state verbs. This ceremony is called asuji, and my sisters and I didn't used to look forward to it very much. Remember, would is not generally used with negatives. In this case, have to is a state verb, since you can't say, I am having to do something. You always say, I have to do something. So, since have to is a state verb, we cannot use it with would. So, we can't say, I remember how we would have to clean the house thoroughly. We can only say, I remember how we used to have to clean the house thoroughly. Now that you have learnt these past structures, let's look at the sentences from the radio talk, which you listened to at the beginning of this video, one more time and check your answers. A few weeks ago, a woman called to report a burglary. It happened at 5 in the afternoon when she was watching the news on TV. This woman used to keep the front door locked. When her son got older, she would leave the door unlocked whenever she was at home. The burglar simply walked in through the front door. The son didn't hear anything because he was listening to music. Then the burglar went into the front room, opened all the cupboards, and took a valuable collection of CDs. Which two sentences provide a background, scene, and action? Which two sentences talk about a single completed action in the past? Which sentence describes a series of completed actions in the past? Which two sentences talk about a repeated action in the past? These two sentences contain a background scene and an action. He was listening to music and she was watching the news on TV. Provide the background scene. It happened and did not hear. Show the action. These two sentences talk about a single completed action. A few weeks ago, a woman called to report a burglary. The burglar simply walked in through the front door. And this sentence describes a series of completed actions in the past. Then the burglar went into the front room, opened all the cupboards, and took a valuable collection of CDs. Finally, these two sentences talk about a repeated action in the past. This woman used to keep the front door locked. When her son got older, she would leave the door unlocked whenever she was at home. Using a range of grammatical structures flexibly can improve your chances of getting a high score in both IELTS writing and speaking. In General Writing Task 1, in many cases, you're asked to give details of a past experience. For example, in this question, you're asked to write a formal letter to the local police station and inform them about your ID card that has been stolen. To describe the details of what happened, you need to use various past tenses. Your ID card has been stolen. Write to the local police station giving details of who you are, what happened, and ask what you should do to get a new ID card. Also, in the speaking test, many Part 2 questions are about past experiences and ask you to describe a past event. To answer these questions, you need to show that you can use different past tenses. Now, listen to a candidate answering this cue card. Listen to his answer and try to find the mistakes. Check the underlined verbs and correct them if they are wrong.
I remember a trip I once made to my grandmother's house. She would live about 30 kilometers away from us, and we used to going there quite often with our mother. On this occasion, we set off to my grandmother's after school on a cold winter's day. When we were about to leave, we were noticing that some snow was beginning to fall. And as we were driving along, we were realizing that it snowed more and more heavily. Suddenly, we had to brake hard as the car in front stopped all of a sudden. We were skidding and went off the road into a ditch. It was pretty scary, but we were lucky and none of us were hurt. We got out of the car, and my mother was phoning for help on her mobile phone. And while we were waiting for help, it was stopping snowing, and we sang lots of pretty songs to keep ourselves cheerful. Eventually, the truck was coming and pulled our car out of the ditch. The car wasn't badly damaged, but we decided to turn around and go home. We didn't manage to see our grandmother that day, but it was so frightening that I will never forget it.
As you may have probably noticed, he made 9 mistakes in his answer. Now, listen to the corrected version of his answer.
I remember a trip I once made to my grandmother's house. She used to live about 30 kilometers away from us, and we used to go there quite often with our mother. On this occasion, we set off to my grandmother's after school on a cold winter's day. When we were about to leave, we noticed that some snow was beginning to fall. And as we were driving along, we realized that it was snowing more and more heavily. Suddenly, we had to brake hard as the car in front stopped all of a sudden. We skidded and went off the road into a ditch. It was pretty scary, but we were lucky and none of us were hurt. We got out of the car, and my mother phoned for help on her mobile phone. While we were waiting for help, it stopped snowing, and we sang lots of pretty songs to keep ourselves cheerful. Eventually, the truck came and pulled our car out of the ditch. The car wasn't badly damaged, but we decided to turn around and go home. We didn't manage to see our grandmother that day, but it was so frightening that I will never forget it.